It was a Friday night when the doorbell rang 3 times. The sharp chime cut straight through the quiet of my apartment, the kind of sound that instantly makes you feel like something important is about to unfold. My name is Cambria Nolan. I'm 35 years old, a financial analyst living in Pittsburgh. And for the first time in many years, I actually felt proud of where I stood in life. Earlier that same morning, my manager had called me into his office to congratulate me on my promotion, along with the raise I had spent nearly a decade working toward. It was the kind of moment that should have felt like pure relief after years of grinding through spreadsheets, late nights, and constant pressure. When I opened the door, my mother was standing there, holding a small store-bought cake with bright frosting that looked slightly smudged from the drive. Behind her stood my father, carrying 2 paper cups filled with cheap wine and wearing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We heard the good news," Mom said as she brushed past me before I could even respond. "Our daughter finally made it." Her voice sounded proud, but there was something else in it too, something familiar and uncomfortable. I stepped aside and let them in, the hallway filling with the strong scent of her perfume and the quiet tension that always followed my parents into any room. They moved through the apartment with an ease that made it feel as though they still lived there. My father pulled out a chair at the kitchen table like it was his usual place, while Mom set the cake down in the center of the counter. Dad lifted his cup slightly and clinked it against mine. "To family," he said, smiling with that heavy tone that I had learned over the years usually meant a request was coming. We exchanged a few minutes of polite conversation about work and the promotion, small talk that felt rehearsed and hollow. Then my mother leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together with a calm, measured expression. "You know we deserve half," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but edged with certainty. "Right after everything we've done for you." The room seemed to shrink around those words. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall, and I watched the second hand glide slowly past the number 12. Those 3 seconds stretched longer than anything I could remember. I stood up without saying a word, walked across the room to the counter, and picked up the envelope I had prepared earlier that day. Carefully, I placed it in front of them. They opened it together. At first, their faces held confidence, but that expression slowly shifted as confusion crept in. Their eyes moved over the contents inside the envelope, searching for something that clearly wasn't there. Neither of them spoke. The silence settled heavily around the table. I took a slow breath, looked directly at them, and said quietly, "That's everything you need." Then I turned away and left them sitting there in the quiet. If you've ever been guilt-tripped by your own parents, stay until the end. You'll see just how far manipulation can go when love slowly turns into control. The next morning, my phone began buzzing nonstop. At first, I assumed it was work-related. Emails from my team, updates from my manager, maybe reminders about upcoming meetings. But when I finally picked up the phone, the screen was flooded with notifications. The brightness of the alerts almost hurt my eyes. There were more than 50 notifications from social media alone. When I opened the first one, my chest tightened instantly. My mother had written a long Facebook post about me. The post was carefully written, filled with old family photos and sentences that sounded gentle at first, but were designed to sting. It began with the words, "Some children forget who raised them once they start earning money." It ended with a dramatic line that read, "No parent deserves to be treated this way." Within a few hours, the post had spread across several Pittsburgh neighborhood groups online. People I barely remembered from years ago were sharing it and leaving their own comments underneath. One old neighbor wrote that she had always thought I acted like I was better than everyone else. My mother's friends responded with hearts and prayer emojis, praising her patience and calling her a wonderful mother. Every comment felt like another accusation thrown into a trial I hadn't even known existed. By the time I arrived at the office that morning, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations quieted when I walked past desks. I could sense people glancing up from their screens, their expressions curious and slightly judgmental. At lunchtime, my supervisor from HR asked me to step into her office for what she described as a quick conversation. The blinds were half closed, and she spoke carefully. "Cambria, I don't want to pry," she said gently. "But is everything okay at home?" The question sounded kind, but underneath it was the unmistakable weight of gossip that had already begun to spread. I nodded and forced a small smile, telling her everything was fine, even though my stomach twisted with unease. When I returned to my desk, my phone lit up again. This time it was a message from my father. His texts were always long and emotional, reading more like lectures than conversations. This one followed the same pattern. He wrote about loyalty and family obligations, about how children owe their parents everything they have. The message stretched on for paragraph after paragraph, every line dripping with guilt. At the very end, one sentence stood alone. "You'll regret this." I stared at the screen until the words blurred together, unsure whether I felt angry or simply drained. Later that afternoon, a neighbor sent me a photo. It showed my mother standing outside my apartment building, a tissue pressed dramatically to her face while tears streaked her makeup. Someone across the street was recording her with their phone. She had turned her pain into a performance, and the internet had become her stage. I set my phone face down on the table and sat quietly for a long time. The faint sound of laughter drifted in through my apartment window from somewhere outside, though I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. As evening approached and the sky faded into a dull blue, my phone rang again. For a moment I assumed it would be another call from one of my parents. Instead, when I answered, I heard the calm voice of my grandmother, Eleanor Nolan. "Let them talk," she said gently. "The truth will outlive the noise." She didn't demand explanations or details. She didn't lecture me or offer empty reassurances. In her quiet, steady way, she simply reminded me that silence could sometimes carry more strength than any argument. After we ended the call, I remained seated in the living room. The faint scent of the cheap wine from the night before still lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of cold coffee sitting on the table. My apartment felt strangely alive despite the silence, filled with the distant hum of the city outside. Maybe Grandma was right. Truth didn't need to shout. It could wait quietly while all the noise eventually burned itself out. 2 weeks later, I drove to my grandmother's small home on the outskirts of Harrisburg. As I pulled into the driveway, she was already standing near the white wooden porch, wrapped in the thick cardigan she always wore when something serious was on her mind. Inside, the kitchen smelled of chamomile tea and fresh lemon bread. Before I could even remove my coat, she poured a cup for me and placed it gently on the table. Her calm presence was oddly comforting, as though she had known I would come long before I actually called. I hadn't driven there to talk about the chaos on social media. I came because the night before I had discovered a white envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a letter stamped with the official seal of the Dauphin County Court. It was a legal notice. My parents had filed a petition. I pulled the document from my bag and placed it carefully on the table in front of her. Grandma read the page slowly, her eyes moving across the lines until her lips tightened slightly. "I received one too," she said quietly, reaching toward the counter where another envelope rested. The paper looked worn from being opened and folded multiple times. "They've asked me to testify as a witness," she continued softly. "It's a parental support petition." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words hung heavily in the air between us, unfamiliar yet impossible to ignore. "They're suing me," I finally whispered. "For support," Grandma nodded, her expression unreadable. "They're claiming you owe them financial assistance for their care." I sank back into the chair, the wood pressing into my spine. The thought of my own parents using the court to demand money felt surreal, almost absurd, yet the papers in front of me were painfully real. Grandma placed her hand over mine. "You need to find legal help," she said. "Don't fight them with anger. That's what they'll expect. Fight them with reason." Her words were steady, but I could hear the disappointment behind them, not at me, but at what our family had become. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. That evening, I reached out to my friend and former college classmate, Grace Turner, now a civil lawyer, who agreed to meet me after work. We sat in a small coffee shop near downtown Harrisburg. Grace had always been sharp, practical, and slightly intimidating in the best way. She scanned the court documents while I stirred my untouched drink, watching the reflection of the fluorescent lights in the dark liquid. "They're using an old state law," she said after a few minutes. "It allows parents to request financial support from adult children if the parents are indigent. It's rare and outdated, but it still exists." I tried to process the words. "Can they actually win?" I asked. Grace sighed softly. "Technically, yes, if they prove financial hardship and show that you can afford to pay. But most judges dismiss these cases when they see manipulation. Still, it could harm your professional reputation if it becomes public. Employers don't always read between the lines." I felt a dull ache building behind my temples. "So they're not just after money. They're trying to embarrass me." Grace nodded. "They want control, not justice. People like that don't handle rejection well." Outside, dusk had settled over the city, the streetlights glowing through a light drizzle. Grace reached across the table and said, "I'll help you, but you need to keep your composure. No social media responses, no messages to them. Let the legal process speak for you." Her tone was firm, protective, like a doctor giving strict instructions to a patient refusing to rest. When I finally drove home, the windshield wipers moved rhythmically, matching the slow beat of my heart. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a family conflict. It was a legal war, and my parents were willing to drag me through every inch of it.
But Grandma's words stayed with me, quiet and steady. Don't fight with anger, fight with reason. By early spring, a white envelope from the court showed up in my mailbox. It was thin, yet somehow heavy in my hands, as if it carried the weight of every conversation I had avoided. Inside was a summons demanding my presence in court 2 weeks from that day. The words were printed in cold black ink. You are required to appear before the Dauphin County Court in response to a parental support petition. Beneath that, the names of my parents stood bold and formal, as though they were strangers rather than the people who had raised me. I sat at my kitchen table, reading it again and again, searching for a line that might tell me it was some sort of mistake. There was none. Enclosed with the notice was a packet labeled "Evidence submitted by the petitioners." I opened it with shaking hands and saw several pages of screenshots, text messages apparently from me promising to send them monthly financial support. The dates were recent, the tone polite, even affectionate, but I had never written any of them. The number attached to the text was similar to mine, only off by 1 digit. When I met with Grace the next morning, she was already pacing her office, a cup of coffee untouched beside her laptop. "They've fabricated evidence," she said after scanning the documents. "This isn't just emotional manipulation anymore, it's fraud." Her words seemed to echo inside me.
Grace immediately started gathering every legitimate piece of communication I had ever exchanged with Mom and Dad. I forwarded my full message history, call logs, and copies of emails. She told me to request my phone carrier's records to prove the fake number wasn't mine. At her suggestion, I also collected my payroll statements, bank records, and tax filings from the past 5 years. Each file became part of a growing binder labeled Defense. Grace was methodical, steady, and ruthless in her precision. "They want to paint you as someone who abandoned them," she said, "so we'll show that you've been independent, responsible, and honest. That's the truth, and the truth leaves a paper trail." That weekend, Grandma called. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to sound calm. "I wrote a letter to the court," she told me. "They asked for my statement, so I told them the truth, that you left home at 18, paid for your own college, and never once asked for help." I felt a lump rise in my throat. Grandma had always spoken plainly, but her words carried the quiet force of decency. "Thank you," I whispered, though it didn't feel like enough. 2 days later, I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Last chance." The message was short: "Pay up or we'll ruin you." There was no signature, no traceable address, just the cold threat lingering on my screen. My pulse quickened, but fear quickly turned into something else: resolve. I took a screenshot, attached the message to an email, and forwarded it to Grace with the note, "Add this to the file." That night, the rain drummed against the windows as I sat on the couch reviewing every document one last time. My living room looked like a war room, folders spread across the floor, post-it notes color-coded by topic, a stack of legal printouts beside my laptop. Yet amid the chaos, I felt strangely calm. I wasn't alone anymore. Grace was guiding me, Grandma had spoken up, and the truth, silent but steady, was on my side. When I finally closed the binder labeled Defense Cambria Nolan, I exhaled deeply. The court date was approaching fast, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim in their story. I was preparing to tell my own. The courthouse smelled like paper and fear. The air was thick with the blend of floor polish, nervous whispers, and the faint click of reporters' pens. I sat beside my lawyer and friend, Grace Turner, at the defense's table, my palms pressed flat against the smooth surface to steady my breathing. The courtroom was almost full. A few local journalists had gathered, whispering as they pointed their cameras toward my parents. They looked smaller than I remembered, yet their presence filled the room with tension. When the bailiff called the session to order, the judge entered, a tall man with gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that had seen too many family disputes. He glanced briefly at each of us before nodding to the clerk to begin. "This hearing concerns the petition for parental financial support filed by Howard and Linda Nolan against their daughter, Cambria Nolan." Hearing my name spoken aloud in that cold official tone made my stomach tighten. Mom was the first to speak. She clutched a tissue in one hand, her voice trembling in a way that felt rehearsed. "Your Honor," she said, "we did everything for her. We supported her education, her dreams, and her life, but she abandoned her family when we needed her most." Her words cracked mid-sentence as she dabbed at her eyes, while Dad placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, the perfect picture of sorrow. A few people in the gallery murmured softly, their sympathy drifting toward her like dust. Grace stood calmly when the judge invited her to respond. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has been financially independent since she turned 18. The petitioners are not destitute, nor are they unsupported. They continue to own 2 properties in Allegheny County, one of which is currently rented for income. In addition, both receive social benefits and retirement payments. The alleged financial hardship is unfounded." Her voice was measured but firm, cutting through the air with precision. The judge frowned slightly and turned to Mom and Dad.
"Do you have documentation of your financial situation?" he asked. Mom hesitated before sliding a folder forward. Grace stepped closer to inspect it. "These are recent bank statements," she said. However, the listed transactions include recurring rental deposits. That confirms property income. The courtroom fell silent. Mom's hands trembled slightly as she tried to explain, but the judge raised his hand, signaling her to stop. Then the clerk announced the next witness. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and my grandmother, Eleanor Nolan, entered slowly, leaning on her wooden cane. Every sound seemed to fade as she made her way to the stand. When she took the oath, her voice was soft yet unwavering. "They have lived off her since she got her first job," she said, her gaze fixed firmly on the judge. "I love my son and daughter-in-law, but truth matters more than comfort. She never owed them anything except respect, and she's given that plenty." The words landed like a strike of lightning. Mom's face flushed red. Dad looked down, and the judge scribbled a few notes before setting his pen aside. Grace handed him a final document, the one that had been sealed months ago in that first envelope. "This," she said, "is a notarized declaration of financial independence, signed by both parties 3 years ago, confirming that Miss Nolan has no ongoing financial obligation to her parents." The judge read the document, carefully adjusted his glasses, and nodded. "In light of this, the court finds the petition not only baseless, but deceptive. The case is dismissed. Furthermore, the petitioners will be fined for presenting falsified evidence." The gavel struck once, firm and final. As the room erupted into murmurs, I turned slightly toward my parents. Mom's tear-streaked face twisted into something colder, a mixture of fear and hatred. Dad avoided my eyes entirely. I stood slowly, my legs steady, my voice silent. Grace gathered our papers, and Grandma gave me a small nod from across the aisle, her expression calm, proud, and infinitely tired. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the spring air hit my face like sunlight after a storm. I thought of that envelope I had given them months ago, the one they never understood. Inside it had been the very document that protected me today, a single sheet of paper that declared freedom not from family, but from manipulation. A week after the verdict, Pittsburgh couldn't stop talking. The story had spread faster than anyone expected, carried by whispers in offices, coffee shops, and church basements. The Pittsburgh Herald ran the headline in bold black letters, "Parents Lose Case Against Daughter." Beneath it, my name appeared again, smaller but impossible to miss. People debated it on morning radio, some praising my courage, others calling the entire thing a tragedy. I stopped listening after the second day. At work, my colleagues tried to act normal, but there was always that subtle pause before anyone mentioned family. My supervisor left a note on my desk that said, "Proud of you for standing your ground." It wasn't much, but it meant more than any apology I'd ever received from my parents. The HR manager later told me she had gotten calls from other employees who wanted to know how the case ended. Proof that gossip travels faster than justice ever can. That Sunday, the local church bulletin mentioned the moral decay of filial respect. I knew exactly who they were referring to. The congregation that once adored Mom and Dad now looked at them differently. Some of their closest friends stopped inviting them to gatherings. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Delaney, who had lived beside them for 20 years, reportedly refused to open her door when Mom showed up to talk. For people who once thrived on image and sympathy, the silence must have been unbearable. In the middle of the week, Grace emailed me a scanned letter embossed with the seal of the Pennsylvania Bar Association.
She had nominated the case for a civil rights publication, and the review board had accepted it. Her message read, "You made legal history today. Very few cases under this law have ever been publicly overturned. Be proud, but stay private." I smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't victory I felt, just a strange, grounded kind of relief. That evening, my phone rang. It was my grandmother, Eleanor Nolan. Her voice was tired but gentle. "They had to sell the house," she said softly. "The fine and legal fees left them no choice. They moved into a smaller place near Greensburg. I don't think they'll reach out again, at least not soon." I closed my eyes and let the silence between us breathe. "Are you all right with that?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "I'm not happy," I said finally, "but I'm not angry either. Maybe that's enough for now," she murmured something kind before hanging up. Later that night, I walked along the Monongah River. The city lights shimmered on the dark surface, rippling with the wind. The air was cold, sharp, alive. I leaned on the railing, watching the reflections twist and scatter like fragments of an old photograph. I didn't feel triumphant, nor broken, just lighter, as if the invisible weight I had carried since childhood had finally lifted. The bridge ahead glowed faintly, and for the first time in months, I realized that peace doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it simply comes when the noise fades, and you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. 3 months later, the first snow fell over Pittsburgh. The
The city seemed quieter under the soft white blanket, as if winter itself wanted to wipe away the noise that had surrounded my name. I had moved into a small apartment near downtown, on the 8th floor of a brick building that overlooked the river. The view wasn't perfect, but the silence was. I furnished it slowly with secondhand furniture and things that felt like mine. A blue velvet chair, a thrifted lamp, a record player. For the first time in years, every corner of my home reflected only one voice, my own. One morning, I opened the mailbox in the lobby and found a small envelope addressed in delicate handwriting. It was from my grandmother. Inside was a simple birthday card with gold edges and a handwritten line. "You did the right thing. Love, Grandma." I held it for a long moment before placing it on my kitchen shelf. It wasn't about approval, it was about acknowledgement. In a family where truth had often been twisted into guilt, her words were an anchor that steadied me. A few days later, another letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar but jagged, the ink pressing deep into the paper. It was from Mom. The note began with a story about her health problems, followed by a request for help with medical bills. There were no apologies, no mention of what had happened in court, only that same quiet expectation that I would step back into the role they had assigned me long ago. I folded the letter neatly, sealed it in an envelope without reply, and dropped it in the trash. My hands didn't shake, my chest didn't ache. I simply knew that silence was sometimes the only boundary that works. Later that week, I called the local welfare office, the same place that had once handled part of their case filings. The clerk confirmed that the parental support petition was permanently closed, marked in the system as resolved without appeal. Hearing those words out loud felt like closing a door that had been left open for years. I thanked the clerk, hung up, and stood by the window for a while, watching the faint snow drifting past the glass. That night, I made dinner for myself. Nothing fancy, just pasta tossed with garlic and olive oil, a glass of red wine, and soft jazz playing from the old record player. The notes filled the apartment like warmth seeping through the walls. For the first time, I didn't feel like someone who had survived something terrible. I felt like someone who had finally learned how to live.
Outside, snow gathered on the railings and rooftops, muting the city's usual hum. I pressed my palm against the cold window pane and let the silence settle inside me. Freedom doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be noticed or celebrated. It arrives quietly, like the first snow over Pittsburgh. Soft, certain, and enough. Half a year later, Grandma passed away peacefully. The news reached me on a quiet morning in late June, through a phone call from one of her church friends. I sat for a long time at the kitchen table, the receiver still in my hand, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Grief did not rush in all at once. It arrived slowly, like mist spreading through an open field. The funeral was small and gentle, held at the same church where she had sung in the choir for decades. People came not to mourn, but to honor a woman whose kindness had never demanded recognition. When it was my turn to speak, I unfolded the letter she had left for me. The handwriting was firm, each word deliberate. Love isn't a transaction. It isn't earned through sacrifice or measured by what you give. It's the freedom to care without keeping score. My voice trembled halfway through, but I finished reading. The silence that followed felt like a blessing. Among her final wishes, my grandmother had left me her small house near Greensburg. The real estate agent said it could sell quickly, that the market was strong. I didn't hesitate. Within a month, I sold the property and donated every dollar to a local foundation that helped women recover from financial abuse. Signing the check felt like the truest way to honor her life, not through inheritance, but through continuation of her quiet strength. In a recorded message played during the ceremony, I said, "That first envelope didn't end our bond. It just told the truth. Love isn't debt." Some people nodded, others wiped their eyes. I meant every word. That envelope, once the symbol of defiance, had become a bridge between who I was and who I had to become. After the funeral, I returned to my apartment in Pittsburgh. I began to live simply. Work, read, cook, sleep. No calls from Mom or Dad came anymore, and I didn't expect any. The silence between us had hardened into permanence, and strangely, it didn't hurt. I watered my plants, paid my bills, and learned that peace can look very ordinary. Sometimes when I walked downtown and past the courthouse, I slowed my steps. The building stood solemn beneath the gray sky, its stone facade cold but certain. I could still hear Grandma's words echoing in memory. Courage has quiet footsteps. It was her final lesson that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply keeps walking, even after everyone else has stopped. I no longer looked back with anger or pity.
Life had moved forward, and so had I. In the quiet rhythm of my days, there was no bitterness left, only understanding. Every choice had carried its own consequence, and I had no regrets. Some people love you only while you're paying their bills. When you stop, they call you selfish. But walking away isn't cruelty, it's clarity. You can't save people who confuse love with obligation, nor should you try. Freedom begins the moment you stop apologizing for setting boundaries. It doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you whole. It makes you free. Thank you for staying till the end. If this story reminded you of a moment when you had to choose peace over guilt, share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Your stories matter more than you know. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories about courage, truth, and the quiet kind of strength that changes everything.